It's a great pleasure to follow the Noble Lord Howell of Guildford and to very much agree with the Noble Lord's introductory remarks about the huge democratic deficit represented by the Cragg process, remarks that have been echoed by most Noble Lords taking part in this debate. Democracy, it would be a good idea. I would hope most people would agree with that. I would also very much agree with the Noble Lord's concluding remarks that we are in a new world and we need new approaches. For what we have before us is something that looks like something very much out of the 20th century rather than fit for the 21st. I do, however, very much want to thank the Noble Lord, Lord Goldsmith, and the International Agreements Committee for their hard and rapid work in preparing this report and securing this debate and introducing it so clearly. I will note that the scrutiny period for the MDA ends on the 23rd of October, which is today, and for the AUKUS agreement on the 29th of October. I might say a hashtag I use frequently on social media, no way to run a country. It would be nice to have more space and time for discussion and thought. Now, this debate occurs, as the Noble Lord, Lord Goldsmith sets it out, as the UK prepares and is spending an enormous amount of money on new nuclear weapons. I must begin by putting on the record the Green Party's opposition to the huge expense and risks of the Trident replacement program in the geopolitical environment where the majority of the world's countries have backed the UN Treaty for a global ban on nuclear weapons. I also note the related context in which the cost of the nuclear clean-up at Sellafield has spilled up to £136 billion, something about which the National Audit Office today was expressing great concern. This on a site where there's been very serious cybersecurity concerns and in which we have yet to find any kind of long-term solution for the storage of nuclear waste. But I am going to focus particularly on the AUKUS agreement, in part because the England and Wales Green Party perspective lines up very much with that of the Australian Greens, and we both bring a different and widely supported voice to the debate in both of our nations. Both of our parties are opposed to the agreement, and that gives me the opportunity to draw this committee's attention to some important points that should, I would respectfully suggest, give the government and all parties pause. I note by way of background that in 2022 the Australian Greens had by far their best ever federal election result, labelled a green slide by the leader Adam Bandt. It saw the election of the first three Green MPs in Brisbane and a significant increase in Senate numbers, and state elected representation has continued to grow since then. We are in a time of considerable political change in the UK, the US and around the world. I note also that, as I have previously noted to this committee, that two former Australian Prime Ministers and one former Australian Foreign Minister, who were not Greens, have all opposed the AUKUS deal. Now, I'm going to begin with a longue durée view and look over more than a century of Australian and UK military cooperation, which has been marked by strong, even slavish support for UK and US actions from the top of the Australian government, but that has not always been backed by, or at first checked with, the Australian public. My speech might be taken as something of a balance and a contrast to that of the Noble Lord, Lord Hannon, not for the first time. First of all, the First World War. Anzac Day, April 25, now marking the contribution of all of those who've served militarily in Australia, initially founded, to quote the historian Martin Crotty, very much around trying to get more people to sign up to the war between 1916 and 1918, after the British-led military disaster of Gallipoli that claimed so many young lives. The Prime Minister of Australia, Billy Hughes, tried twice to extend service for conscriptees outside Australian shores to feed more lives into the horrors of the trenches when the flow of volunteers dried up. Twice the Australian public said no. And I will note in passing that the Australian Labor Party subsequently split. Then, on the 3rd of September 1939, Prime Minister Robert Menzies told the Australian people that they were at war with Nazi Germany. That came just an hour after Britain had declared war, and while there is no doubt that the Australian public was and remained behind the government, there was considerable concern and doubt, as there had been in the then dominions of Canada and South Africa, about the Australian Prime Minister's assumption of automaticity. The slavish abandonment of any idea of Australian sovereignty is something that has echoes, which I'll come back to today. Now, without doing a detailed trawl through Australian history, I'll just stop briefly at the Vietnam War moratorium protests, the first of which took part on the 8th of May 1970, which were then the largest public demonstrations in Australia's history, which represented a growing resistance from a significant number of Australians to the government's commitment to the Vietnam War in general and conscription in particular. On the 16th of February 2003, more than 500,000 people took part in protests across Australia against the US-led invasion of Iraq, the largest anti-war protests in Australia's history. I think the committee can see the pattern that I'm drawing out here and should perhaps reflect that Australia is, however imperfectly, a democracy, and there is a strong chance that public views may eventually influence political choices. Now, Australian officials believe, and of course it's been widely acknowledged that it's extremely hard to estimate the cost of the AUKUS program over its life, but the long-term cost of the submarine plan is likely to be about 0.15% of Australia's entire gross domestic product per year, on average. For context, in 2023, that was put as a comparable cost to boosting the resourcing of schools across the entire nation to what was seen to be an essential minimum standard. But the objections are not just about costs. I draw Noble Lord's attention to the Australian Greens dissenting report for the Senate Committee on Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade report on the Naval Nuclear Propulsion Bill 2023. It's readily available, so I won't discuss it at length, but I want to pick out a couple of key points. To quote, first of all, there are environmental, health, security and social risks associated with every facet of the nuclear industry. These risks disproportionately impact First Nations peoples and their lands, close quote. And I note that the very much unfinished business of the treatment of First Nations in Australia has recently been very strongly highlighted. Now, to continue with the report, I continue to quote that the two major parties, brackets in Australia, have worked together to ensure a short time frame on the reporting of this inquiry and not enabled times for public hearings. The Australian public has not been properly consulted on the AUKUS proposal, close quotes. And I think we can see the clear echo here at the complaints that we've heard across this committee. Now, the report concludes that the deal undermines Australian sovereignty, violates international nuclear safety principles, and notes also that Australia's Defence Strategic Review rejected advice from the International Atomic Energy Agency and the Australian Government's own Nuclear Safety Advisory Council, which recommended that an independent regulator have oversight of the program. Finally, the report notes that the Australian public has rejected nuclearisation for nearly a century. It might be of particular interest to the government that both the Electrical Trades Union and the Australian Manufacturers Workers Union, two very prominent Australian unions, both strongly oppose the development of a nuclear industry in Australia or any end to the moratorium on nuclear power. That, my lords, is the political context of the AUKUS deal. You might think that that presents considerable political risks. You would be right. And I would also just note that that reflects the conclusion of a report published in the last week by the US Congressional Research Service. It says the military context, the costs of AUKUS Pillar 1 could reduce, perhaps significantly, funding for other Australian military capabilities. And it says, I think very crucially, that no alternatives were ever considered by any of the AUKUS partners. We come back to democratic scrutiny and consideration, and this is, I repeat, the US Congressional Research Service report. Finally, my Lords, the timing of this debate all too acutely highlights the geopolitical context of which the relationship with Australia is a small, if significant, part. First, there is the approaching US election, at which there is at least an even money chance that we will see a second Donald Trump presidency, and a risk that even if that is not the result, we will see that candidate seeking to claim the presidency. I'm not going to get into the details of today's row, but this is not a politically stable time in US history to be making deals such as either of these. And the CHOGM meeting in Samoa, for which our Prime Minister may just about have landed after 26 hours, but at which he will not be joined by the leaders of India and South Africa, because they are at the BRICS meeting hosted by the Russian President Vladimir Putin in Kazan, where the Chinese President Xi Jinping is also in attendance. Canada, too, is sending neither Prime Minister nor Foreign Minister to CHOGM. I said in our debate in the Defence Review, and I will repeat it now, that the UK needs to consider far more than defence in isolation, and to consider its place and relationships in the world of multiple security threats, not just the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the threats that China presents with its denial of the joint declaration in Hong Kong and the threats to the democratic entity of Taiwan, but also the multiple security threats of the climate emergency, the nature crisis, the multiple health threats. And I'll draw attention to an extremely disturbing report in Vanity Fair about the H5N1 virus in US dairy herds and that country's wholly inadequate public health response. The agreements we are debating today already look, and in the future are likely to look even more so, like 20th century relics, sitting dangerously and expensively unstably in the 21st century world. The security of our country and the world cannot afford such outdated approaches.